Can you tell the one about when Miss McGee? Um, okay.
Well, this was in 1964 during Freedom Summer in Mississippi when college students and young people like the Young Turks came from all over the United States to work in Mississippi on voter registration. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, had been the project director in Greenwood, and when he left to go to Tallahatchie County, Jim Foreman asked me to be the temporary project director in Greenwood. The SNCC office, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, moved en masse to Greenwood, Mississippi. And one of the things we had to do was to do the voter registration work, but also work with the young people. And the Public Accommodations Act of '64 had just been passed, and they were very active in trying to integrate the movie theaters, bowling alleys, etc. And one of the things that we had to do in the SNCC office, especially the Greenwood Project Office, was to go down with these lawyers from the North and bail some of our young black activists out of jail. So one day, Jake McGee, the son of Mrs. McGee, who was one of the main leaders of Greenwood civil rights movement, was arrested. And we got a call, and so I went down to the jail with Mrs. McGee and the lawyer that was there with us for a couple of weeks. And on the way down, I explained to the lawyer that when you go in to talk about making bail for Jake McGee, you be sure that you go with Mrs. McGee in to talk to the chief of police. And oh sure. So as soon as they got down there, the lawyer reverted to form. The police chief invited the lawyer into his office to discuss Jake McGee, and they closed the door in Mrs. McGee's face. Well, she reached for the knob of the door to go into the office, and Ralph, the local policeman, jumped in front of her and said, "You can't go in there." And Mrs. McGee said, "You better believe I can go in there. They're talking about my son. I'm going in there." He said, "No, you're not." And before I knew it, I'm the nonviolent director of the project in Greenwood. Mrs. McGee, not understanding nonviolence completely, slugged Ralph so hard she knocked him out. And here's this local cop going down, half unconscious, reaching for his gun. So I had, of course, to tackle him nonviolently and make sure that he didn't shoot Mrs. McGee. So as he was sliding down the door, Mrs. McGee was following up. She was not letting up on Ralph, and he was beating him into the ground. And his head is hitting the door, and all of a sudden the police chief and the lawyer, they start trying to get out, and they're hitting Ralph in the back of the head with the door. And finally the police chief said, "Zeldner, what's going on out there?" And I said, "Chief, Ralph is trying to shoot Mrs. McGee." And he said, "Well, let us the hell out of here." And I said, "Well, if you'll make Ralph promise not to shoot Mrs. McGee, we'll let you out." So he said, "Ralph, don't you shoot Mrs. McGee." So I dragged Ralph away, making sure to hold on to his hand and his gun belt and his gun. And they came out, and we all thought, well, Mrs. McGee is going to go to jail now for battery. But you know, the funny thing was, Eric, that they never charged with Mrs. McGee with beating up Ralph because they didn't want it to get out that a local black woman had beaten up a white policeman.